Bonn, Germany, in the late 18th century. A peaceful place, with people who drank beer and cared about ordinary things. Until we enter the Van Beethoven house, a home where the air felt much heavier than usual inside the rooms, due to the thick vapors of wine and the many frustrated ambitions that filled every corner of that dark place. There, little Ludwig was not playing with wooden toy soldiers, nor was he chasing cats along the banks of the Rhine. He was standing in front of a keyboard, with teary eyes and legs tired from standing for many long hours, while his father Johann forced him to practice until the early hours of the morning without any rest at all. Johann was a court tenor with a mediocre talent and a very worrying addiction to the bottle of cheap wine, but he had a master plan. He wanted to manufacture his own Mozart. If Wolfie had achieved it before him, why wouldn't his own offspring be the new golden goose for the family's wealth and future status in Bonn? So, if it was necessary to give him a couple of slaps, or to lock him in the dark cellar, or to kick him awake at 3 in the morning after a wild night of drinking at the local tavern, Johann did not hesitate to apply his particular and violent pedagogical method so the notes would sound absolutely perfect every time. The result was a child prodigy, yes, but one who carried a deep melancholy the size of a giant cathedral, and a resentment towards authority that would accompany him all the way to his grave in the very distant future. Ludwig was not exactly the life of children's parties. He was a potential genius with a very difficult personality, with a hairstyle that was already beginning to defy the laws of physics and common sense of the time, and a character that simmered slowly between imposed sonatas and physical punishments during those cold and very dark nights. At 17, tired of Bonn's oppressive atmosphere and his father's delusions of grandeur, Ludwig decided it was time to leave. Ludwig decided to set out for Vienna, the world capital of music, seeking a new beginning for his artistic career. A place where if you didn't know how to play the harpsichord, you were basically a second-class citizen there. His first encounter with the great Mozart is part of musical mythology, a moment that would change history forever. They say that Wolfgang, after hearing him improvise, told his friends that this young man will give the world talk. Or perhaps he simply thought that the boy needed a good barber and a clean change of clothes instead. But family tragedy, that unwanted guest that always chased him, arrived once again to disrupt his new life in Vienna, forced him to return home prematurely after receiving news about the failing health of his mother, Maria. She was the only emotional pillar he had left, the only person who softened the many blows of life. And her death from tuberculosis left him sunk in a deep depression that lasted for a very long time. It wasn't until 1792 when he finally returned to Vienna to stay there definitely and pursue his destiny. Just as the troops of Napoleon were beginning to shake the entire map of Europe with their military power. This time he arrived to study with Haydn, the living legend whom everyone affectionately called Papa Haydn in Vienna. However, for a 22-year-old Beethoven, Haydn was far too conservative, too neat, and too much of the old world. Ludwig, with that arrogance that only geniuses who know they are going to change history possess, acted on his own. He corrected his own exercises behind his teacher's back and sought other teachers in secret during the cold Viennese nights, because he felt Haydn had nothing new to teach him. The relationship was like that of a rebellious teenager with a father who only wants him to wear a tie. Beethoven wanted to break windows with his powerful music, and Haydn only wanted him to close them so that no cold draft of air would enter the quiet room. In Vienna, Beethoven began to make a name for himself, but not only because of his truly prodigious musical technique, but for his ability to scandalize the aristocracy with his barbarian manners and his very rude, defiant social behavior. Imagine an elegant salon in the Lobkowitz Palace, filled with many powdered wigs and very wealthy, refined people, smelling of expensive French perfume, and people talking about court gossip in very refined and quiet whispers all around. Suddenly, this short, dark man arrives with ill-fitting clothes and an attitude of, "I am better than all of you." He sits at the piano and begins to pound the keys with a force that had never been seen before. It was not the delicate, crystalline music expected to accompany tea. It was a powerful storm of raw, deep emotions. Beethoven used the pianoforte, that ancestor of the modern piano, that allowed for a change in sound intensity. This allowed for varying the intensity of the sound, depending on the force with which the keys were struck. Ludwig pushed it to the limit, breaking strings and hammers because the wooden instruments of that time were very fragile. They simply were not designed to withstand his high level of aggression and passion while he was playing his compositions. The most ironic part is that the nobles, far from kicking him out, loved him precisely for that raw savagery. The ruder he was to them, the more money they gave him. Beethoven could interrupt a concert halfway through easily because someone was talking in the back row, call his patrons asses, and even so, they stayed for more. The princes fought to be his patrons. He was the first truly independent artist in history, a real musical pioneer. Someone who did not consider himself a servant in livery, but a titan who treated archdukes as equals every day, convinced that his nobility came from his brain and not from his last name or his family heritage in Bonn. But just when the world was at his feet, with music publishers fighting over his scores and his great fame and his fame crossing borders, fate decided to play the heaviest and cruelest joke in the entire history of music. Ludwig began to hear strange noises that were not in his compositions. He didn't know what was happening to him. At first, they were persistent hums, as if he had a swarm of mosquitoes trapped in his ear, permanently inside. Then, the voices of people in the taverns began to sound like distant whispers or very muffled, quiet echoes. And the high notes of the violins simply disappeared from his auditory spectrum, leaving him in a silent, empty world. A musician going deaf is like a taster losing their sense of taste, or a painter going blind suddenly. It is technically the end of the game for any musician. Fear began to devour him completely from the deep inside. He began to avoid lavish social gatherings so that no one would notice he could not hear a single word said. Because he couldn't hear what people said, he became sullen and avoided any eye contact during those difficult Viennese nights. He grew paranoid and withdrew into himself, gaining a reputation for being a misanthrope who hated being around other people, which hid a terrifying vulnerability. In 1802, following the desperate advice of his doctor, he finally decided to leave. He retired to a quiet little village called Heiligenstadt, hoping that the silence of the countryside would help him heal, and hoping that the fresh air would perform the miracle that the medicine of that time simply could not achieve. Based on leeches and strange ointments, medicine failed. There was no miracle, only the realization that it was all useless. Only the confirmation that absolute silence was inevitable. There, in a moment of total darkness and also of great despair, in absolute darkness and despair, he wrote what we know today as the Heiligenstadt Testament, a very famous document. This is the Heiligenstadt Testament, a heartbreaking letter addressed to his brothers where he shared his most painful secret thoughts, where Beethoven confessed that he had been on the verge of taking his own life because of his great suffering, but that his art was the only thing holding him back in this dark world of shadows and deep silence. It was as if the genius were asking for forgiveness for his bad temper and his very difficult, aggressive social behavior, explaining that his arrogance and isolation were nothing more than a shield to hide his growing disability from everyone, to hide his growing disability from the world. It is a document that mixes the purest tragedy with human strength. With a superhuman determination, Beethoven decided that, if he could not hear the music of the outside world any longer, he would write the powerful music that thundered inside his head and within his own soul instead of listening. And that music was going to be much more powerful, disruptive, and emotional than anything the world had ever heard, than anything that the human ear had ever processed until that very moment in the history of all Western music. It was the birth of the romantic artist, the one who does not compose by commission or royal command anymore, but out of a vital need for expression. From this breaking point, we enter his famous and powerful heroic stage. We enter his heroic stage, a period where Beethoven no longer composed just to please the wealthy Viennese aristocrats. He composed for posterity and to challenge the gods with his massive and very complex new musical structures and sounds. His music became longer, more structurally complex, and much louder than any other piece written during that classical era. Almost as if he wanted to force his own ears to register the sound of the orchestra once again. Meanwhile, on the political horizon, a figure appeared that fascinated and terrified everyone in Europe at the same time in equal parts: Napoleon. For Ludwig, Napoleon was the symbol of liberty and the great hero of the revolution, the great liberator who was going to overthrow hereditary tyrants and bring a new era of equality to Europe. He was so enthusiastic about these Republican ideals that he dedicated his new symphony, his Third Symphony, the Eroica, a powerful work that broke all the established rules of classical harmony in that era. It is said that the original manuscript had the name of Bonaparte written on the cover with such immense pressure that the quill almost pierced the paper, leaving deep marks that showed the composer's high level of excitement and devotion. However, when news reached him in 1804 that Napoleon had crowned himself Emperor of the French, he felt deeply betrayed. Beethoven flew into one of his famous and legendary fits of rage, screaming at the top of his lungs alone. "Is he too just an ordinary man?" he shouted furiously at his friends, who watched him in total terrified silence, before lunging toward the musical score and crossing out the name of Napoleon with a very fast and violent hand, with such viciousness that he actually tore through the first page of his own great masterpiece in that silent room. The symphony was renamed simply Eroica Symphony, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man instead of the emperor, making it clear that the genius would not kneel before any monarch, not even the one he had most admired. His daily life in the Austrian capital became a legendary mess that reflected his chaotic and very brilliant inner world, which fueled gossip throughout the entire city of Vienna, as everyone talked about the strange habits of the composer. Beethoven changed houses almost as often as his mood, moving from one apartment to another in a constant hurry, ending up living in more than 60 different apartments throughout his long and very productive stay in the city. His homes were absolute chaos, with remains of petrified food and musical scores stained with coffee scattered on the floor. Pianos without legs because he rested them directly on the floorboards to feel the music in his own body, to try and feel the physical vibrations of the notes in his body while he played with absolute intensity, and used chamber pots that were sometimes confused with soup bowls in the dim, dark corners of his room. His personal hygiene was, to say the very least, quite creative and erratic for a man of his great status. He had the habit of pouring buckets of cold water over his head to clear his mind during composition sessions, while composing frantically, not caring at all that the water would leak through the cracks in the wooden floor, to the floor below, to the absolute despair of his neighbors and his very angry landlords in the building. He was a man who could be composing an ode to universal beauty while living in total visual misery, while living in the most absolute visual and olfactory misery, surrounded by trash and old, dirty, smelly clothes. But amid all that chaos of dirty clothes and broken furniture, there was still room for the heart's mystery. Among his private papers, 3 passionate letters addressed to an immortal beloved were found after his tragic death. A woman whose exact identity has had music historians fighting and arguing for many centuries until this very day. and publishing contradictory theses for centuries about who this mysterious and hidden woman could have really been. Beethoven loved with the same volcanic intensity with which he wrote his powerful and world-famous Fifth Symphonies. But he always seemed to choose unreachable women, aristocrats who, by the social laws of that time, were off-limits. Could never marry a commoner musician who was grumpy and, to top it all off, deaf. His love stories were like many of the endings of his symphonies. Many powerful chords, a lot of built-up tension, and much promise of resolution, but they never ended up closing the deal in real life. In this era, his obsession with control reached almost comical details, such as his relationship with coffee. Beethoven demanded that every cup of coffee he drank in the morning be prepared with exactly 60 grains, neither one more nor one less, and he often counted them himself, one by one, to make sure that his intellectual fuel was absolutely perfect. If the service brought a cup with 59 grains, the day began with a storm of screams. This need for mathematical precision contrasted with his inability to handle the most basic household accounts, or to maintain a coherent conversation without ending up arguing over an auditory misunderstanding. As his deafness progressed, his communication with the world was reduced to the conversation notebooks, where friends and visitors wrote their questions and he responded out loud, often with an uncontrolled volume that scared the passers-by in the streets of Vienna. Ludwig walked through the city gesturing, humming melodies at the top of his lungs, and with clothes so disheveled that the local police were about to arrest him more than once, thinking he was a drunk vagrant, without suspecting that this disheveled man carried the structure of the musical universe in his head. But if his love life was a disaster of epic proportions that not even his best sonatas could sweeten, his family life was not far behind in the ranking of personal catastrophes. After the death of his brother Caspar in 1815, Beethoven decided that his new mission in life, besides revolutionizing Western music, would be to become the legal guardian of his nephew Karl. The problem was that Ludwig had the same capacity for family diplomacy as an elephant in a fine china shop. He embarked on a fierce and exhausting 5-year legal battle against his own sister-in-law, Johanna, whom he nicknamed with poison the Queen of the Night, suggesting she was a woman of loose morals and a nefarious influence for little Karl. Beethoven was convinced that he was the only one capable of turning the boy into a man of worth, so he used all his influence, his contacts with the aristocracy, and a large part of his savings to snatch custody away. The result was a domestic tragedy bordering on the absurd, a deaf, choleric, and deeply disordered genius attempting to raise a teenager who only wanted to be left alone to live his own life. This situation generated a constant cognitive dissonance. You know, that state of mental tension that occurs when your deepest beliefs, in this case, his idea of being his nephew's moral savior, clash head-on with a much more painful and contradictory reality that you cannot control. Karl, caught in the middle of a crossfire between a mother who manipulated him emotionally and an uncle who suffocated him with impossible expectations and an almost police-like surveillance, ended up attempting to take his own life years later by shooting himself in the head. It was a devastating blow that aged Beethoven 10 years in a single afternoon, forcing him to understand that he could not direct the lives of human beings with the same mathematical precision with which he conducted a chamber orchestra. While his personal world was crumbling between lawsuits, screams, and disappointments, his music entered a metaphysical dimension that no one in his time fully understood. In his final years, Beethoven was disconnected from the sounds of the physical world and from Vienna's musical fashions that he began to write pieces that his contemporaries considered strange, directly unplayable, or the result of a disturbed brain that had lost connection to reality. His late string quartets were so advanced and strange to 19th century ears that critics published that the master had finally lost his mind along with his hearing. When musicians complained that a technical part was physically impossible to play, he didn't care. Ludwig simply shouted at them that he did not care about their damned instruments, because he was writing for the future, not for them or for that narrow time. He did not compose for the audience of 1824. He composed for us, for a posterity that could finally decipher his complex sonic labyrinths of human emotion. He was alone and sick, with serious liver problems likely from his love for cheap wine, which was often adulterated with lead in those days, leaving him slowly poisoned. But he still kept one last and gigantesque declaration of principles to make to the world. That declaration was the Ninth Symphony, a work that changed the rules forever. Imagine the scene, the Kärntner Tor Theater in Vienna, on the night of May 7, 1824. The place was crowded with people who had paid exorbitant prices to see the living myth, since Beethoven had not appeared on a public stage in 12 very long years. The master climbs to the podium, disheveled as always, wearing a coat that is too large, and stands with his back to the audience to supervise Michael Umlauf's direction. He is so deaf that he can hear nothing, not even the murmur of expectation from thousands of people, nor the sound of violins tuning, nor even the thunderous boom of the timpani he himself wrote. The music begins, and suddenly, the unthinkable happens in the Grand Theater. For the first time in the history of great symphonies, a human choir bursts into the final movement to sing a poem to universal brotherhood and joy. It is a moment of such brutal emotional power that it overflows the very walls of the theater and makes even the most hardened attendees weep. When the work ends with that apotheosic finale, and the audience erupts in the loudest ovation in Vienna's history, Beethoven remains standing there, his back to the people, arms raised in a conducting gesture, and turning pages of a score that only sounds inside his head, several bars behind what the actual orchestra has just finished playing. It had to be the young contralto Caroline Unger who, with tears in her eyes, approached him and took him gently by the shoulders, and turned him around so he could finally see the forest of clapping hands, waving handkerchiefs and hats flying through the air as a sign of absolute respect. Only then, seeing the crowd's visual delirium, did Beethoven understand that he had triumphed, and he bowed to greet them with a humility he did not show often. It was his last great public triumph, the exact moment where the absolute silence of his private life was defeated by the cry of joy of an entire civilization that recognized him. After that creative climax, his physical health fell into an irreversible tailspin that not even his iron will could stop. His apartment became a constant parade of doctors who performed abdominal punctures without anesthesia on him to relieve his suffering, rather rudimentary surgical procedures to drain fluids, with the aim of relieving his dropsy. Beethoven endured this ordeal with an enviable black humor, comparing himself to an old well from which the doctors always drew water, but that never quite finished emptying. Even on his deathbed, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts and chaos, he kept his irony intact until the last second. When he received from his publisher some cases of Rhine wine that he liked so much, his last words recorded for history were a comic and tragic lament at the same time. Pity, pity, too late. On March 26, 1827, the end finally came. During an unusual thunderstorm that violently shook the rooftops and windows of Vienna, Ludwig van Beethoven closed his eyes forever. Witnesses say a deafening thunder rolled at the exact moment of his passing, and that he, in a final gesture of defiance against the fate that had punished him so much, raised his clenched fist toward the sky before letting out his very last breath. The funeral was an unprecedented sociological event for a simple commoner musician. 20,000 people, almost a quarter of Vienna's total population at that time, came out to say goodbye, forming a human tide that blocked carriages and walkways. Schools closed their doors, and the army had to intervene to maintain a minimum level of order. Among the sobbing crowd, and Franz Schubert himself, who was also there, was one of the official torchbearers lighting the way toward the Church of the Trinity. Vienna, the same city that had called him crazy 1,000 times before, which had seen him wander like a drunk vagrant through its alleys and laughed at his eccentricities, now wept inconsolably for the man who had given an eternal voice to the human spirit. Beethoven left physically, but he left us a legacy that is, in essence, a manual of instructions on how to face the most extreme adversity in life. If life decides to take your hearing to isolate you, force it to listen to you forever. His music is not just a combination of perfect notes on a page. It is the epic chronicle of a man who decided never to give up. A messy genius who, among cups of 60 coffee beans counted one by one, and pianos destroyed by the sheer force of his volcanic and deep passion, changed history without having physically heard a single note of his greatest and most glorious victory.